What do you think will happen to my Venusaur EX that currently has Poison, Burn, and Confuse status all at once? And here is it receiving the Burn as well, of which I do not recover from. So this is what its effects list looks like. It's got Poisoned, Burned, and Confused. If I were to give it a Lumb Berry at this moment, what do you think will happen? A, will it immediately cure all the conditions? Or B, will it first take the burn and poison damage and the attack has to flip a coin because of the confused status before then it cures all of the conditions? Or maybe is it C, some mixture of suffering burn, poison, and confused? We're gonna get back to this towards the end of the video because this video is about special conditions in the game, as well as some other effects as well, such as preventing attack, preventing retreat. Have you ever wondered how Arceus's ability prevents it from special conditions, but what exactly are special conditions? If it were up against an Arbok that prevented from retreating, does that count as a special condition? I'll also show you some niche situations in which using a Lumb Berry is completely useless, even if your Pokemon has a status condition on it. And we'll also cover how to counter certain status conditions most effectively, and why status condition is relatively useless against Pokemon like Solgaleo EX. Firstly, we kind of have to define a few terms. Now, during any battles, when you have an effect applied to a Pokemon, including things like status conditions like Poison Burned, or maybe retreat cost reduction, or maybe Giovanni and Red, there's an effects list. So this effects list include all things whether there's special conditions or not. These three being special conditions, Leaf Cape is not a special condition, but it is an effect. So what are the special conditions? Now just bear with me even if you know this, because in going through the basics here will actually help us explain what the outcome was for the Venusaur and Lumb Berry situation at the start of the video. So in this game there are 5 special conditions. They are Poison, Burn, Asleep, Paralyzed, and Confused. In the main games, Poison, Burned, Asleep, Paralyzed are called status conditions. Confused is called a volatile status condition. So in TCG, these are not called status condition, they are called special conditions. That's always been the case in the physical TCG, that's always been the case as well. And so let's just quickly go through the 5 special conditions, but do pay attention because the details do matter. Poison does 10 damage during the Pokemon checkup, which is in between turns. So at the end of the turn, before your opponent starts their turn, it's called a Pokemon checkup. That's when it does 10 damage. Poison is a stackable condition, so you can put it together with Burned or Asleep, Paralyzed, Confused, it doesn't really matter, it can be stacked. Burned does 20 damage at every checkup, but you get to flip a coin, and if you flip heads, you'll be cured of the Burned. Comparatively, Poison can't be cured with a coin flip, it has to be cured by other means such as retreating or using items or supporter cards. Burn can also be stacked, you can put it together with Poison, you can put it together with Asleep, Paralyzed, Confused. For Asleep, your Pokemon cannot attack nor retreat, but you get to flip a coin every checkup in order to see if you can wake up from the sleep and be cured of this condition. In fact, immediately after your opponent has applied sleep on you, at the end of the turn, at the first checkup, you can already flip a coin to try and be cured of the sleep. So if you flip heads, actually nothing really happened. Paralyzed is the same as the sleep, except that you don't get to flip a coin, you're just guaranteed to not attack and not retreat, but it's only for 1 turn. So after the owner of that Pokemon's turn finishes during that checkup, it'll be cured of Paralyzed. Now this is actually quite important for how Lumb Berry plays out in a moment. As for Confused, you need to flip a coin before you make an attack, and if you flip tails, your turn ends and you don't make the attack. But whether you flip heads or tails, Confuse remains on your Pokemon unless you cure it by some special means like retreating or using items or supporter cards. It cannot naturally otherwise be cured. And among those 5 special conditions, 3 of them cannot be stacked with each other, and they are Asleep, Paralyzed, and Confused. If you do apply a new status condition, the new one overtakes the old one. But Burned and Poison can be stacked with any of these 3. Now, Replacing Asleep, Paralyzed, and Confused with each other may or may not be a good thing. Let me show you an example. So in this example, my Spiritomb has applied Confused on the Macago, but what I've decided to do now, just for example's sake, is to apply Asleep to the opponent, replacing the Confused with Asleep. And what's funny is now that I've replaced it with Asleep, my opponent can flip a coin to see if they can be cured of that condition, and they did. So because of that, my opponent has now got no status condition at all. So that affects how your opponent will then play the game following that. If they're confused, they might have to decide whether they're going to gamble on the coin flip. Since they're not confused, with Asleep, the coin flip is done at the start, so they don't have to gamble because the gambling is already done. They just have to play the cards according to the outcome. Now you might say this deck isn't really used anyway. It's not like anyone's going to use both Asleep and Confusion in the same deck. Well, actually there is one card right now that can do both, and it's a Alolan Muck. It can do, in fact, all 5 status conditions just at random. So knowing that some status conditions will replace others and in some situations actually be worse off for you, Alolan Muck can be quite a gamble. Of course, if Alolan Muck had given you the stackable conditions like Poisoned and Burned, then it's almost always a good thing. And one more piece of information before we go through the hard examples. What is a Pokemon checkup? A Pokemon checkup is something that happens in between turns. So at the end of your turn or at the end of your opponent's turn, it's not part of a turn. It's after the end of a turn. The game checks for any outstanding outcomes like abilities or status conditions during this time. And it says here, any Pokemon that has no HP remaining at the end of a Pokemon checkup is knocked out. Now I had to read between the lines here a little bit. At first it sounded like Pokemon that has no HP is determined to be knocked out only at the Pokemon checkup, but that's not what this means. It just means that if anything happens during a checkup, a Pokemon that has no HP remaining will be knocked out. It doesn't mean that a Pokemon cannot be knocked out during a turn otherwise. So a Pokemon can still be knocked out during a turn or during a Pokemon checkup. And then it says if both players have special conditions affecting them, then the player whose turn just ended checks their special conditions first. Now I'm not sure that that has any relevance in the grand scheme of things because I checked this. If both sides have poison applied and would both be knocked out, it would end in a tie. It doesn't actually mean that the person who checks the poison first, so if your opponent's turn just ended and they got defeated by poison and you have poison on your Pokemon as well, which would have been defeated as well, it doesn't mean that your opponent would lose. In fact, here is the example. Both Pokemon have 10 HP left, both are poisoned, and at the Pokemon checkup, they both defeated. Even though my opponent checks the poison first, and then I check the poison, we do end in a tie. So all of the status conditions are checked before then determining who the winner of the game is, if the game has ended. And then the game tells us that if there are multiple special conditions, they will be checked in this order. Confused is not here because it's only checked when you make an attack. Now, understanding the timing is actually crucial to understanding how the outcomes will play out. Let me show you a similar example to the poison example I just showed you. In this situation, both my opponent and I both have 2 points. So whoever wins the last point should win. But as you can see, we're both poisoned. So if I didn't make an attack, as you saw earlier, we would end in a tie because both of us will enter Pokemon checkup and then poison will apply to both of us and we both lose the Grimer. But what would happen if I make an attack? So if I make the 10 damage against my opponent, because an attack happens during a turn, poison checkup hasn't happened yet, this is what happens. So yes, while the poison would have defeated me as well, the Pokemon checkup hasn't happened, my opponent's been defeated within my turn, and therefore I win. We actually covered this concept in a previous video explaining how winning conditions are determined. In that video, I compared Rocky Helmet with poisons, so it was under slightly different circumstance, but the idea is the same. Rocky Helmet takes priority over poison because Rocky Helmet, the damage is done during a turn, whereas poison gets calculated in the Pokemon checkup, which is in between turns. So as I said, it's quite important to know when something happens. So now let's go back to our Venusaur example. One thing to note is that unlike Pokemon Center Lady, Lumberry doesn't cure special conditions straight away. It gets attached as a Pokemon tool first, and then according to the description, it will cure your Pokemon of any special conditions at the end of the turn. But when is the end of the turn? Well, let's take a look. This Venusaur is currently affected by Confused, Burned, and Poisoned. I'm going to make an attack. It's going to check for Confused, and it failed to make the attack. Then Lumberry activates and cures my Venusaur of the Poison, Confused, and Burned. So that means Lumberry didn't help with the confusion on that first attack anyway. Of course, confusion persists. If I didn't have Lumberry, I would be confused in the next time I attack as well. So it does help long term to have Lumberry cure of confusion. But what it really did for this turn is that both Poisoned and Burned were cured before their effects were applied. Because Lumberry is consumed at the end of a turn, that means before a Pokemon checkup. So as you can see, the timing is crucial to understand how this works. Attack goes first, Lumberry is consumed, then a Pokemon checkup to determine what damage is done by Poisoned or Burned. Which raises a really weird other question. What happens with paralysis? If you apply Lumberry as a tool on a Pokemon that is already paralyzed, it's going to be cured at the end of the turn anyway, and your Lumberry does the same thing, cure it of the paralysis. Will the Lumberry be consumed and then it's gone, like you've just done nothing because the paralysis would have cured itself anyway? Or since the curing would have happened anyway, would the Lumberry not be consumed and be kept for the next time a special condition is applied and then consumed? So let's look at what normally should happen if you already have Lumberry applied. So your opponent makes an attack, then flips a coin, and it's heads, so you would get paralyzed, but because of Lumberry and it's the end of their turn, that gets cured. So this is what would normally happen. But in this example, my Dedenne is going to apply paralysis on the Grimer, and here is the Dedenne flipping ahead in order to apply the paralysis. Then my opponent applies the Lumberry to the Grimer. Now of course it doesn't get immediately healed, and of course they can't attack, so they just end their turn. But then look at this. The Lumberry cures the paralysis that would have been cured anyway. So then if you think about it, they just lost a Lumberry for absolutely no reason. They could have kept it for another turn. I'm not saying that there's a lot of need for Lumberry in this battle, but that was an unnecessary move. The Lumberry did absolutely nothing. But had you gone through the steps of understanding when status conditions are checked, if you think about it, they couldn't make an attack, so they end their turn. Lumberry goes first because it happens at the end of a turn, and then Pokemon checkup happens. Had it been the other way around, they would have kept the Lumberry. So in terms of paralysis, the only real use for Lumberry is to prevent the paralysis, not to cure the paralysis. It does absolutely nothing for curing. Alternatively, you could just use Pokemon Center Lady or a Big Malasada in order to cure the paralysis instead. And by the way, one more interesting fact, let's go back to the Venusaur example where my Venusaur was all burned and poisoned and confused. And to set this up, it took me quite a while. It almost took me all the way to turn 30, which is the end of the game. You can't go beyond turn 30 in a private matchup. Now, take a look at this. So I've got burned on my Venusaur right now. So just burned, and I make an attack. And because it's turn 30, the battle is over because the turn limit has been reached and it's a tie. But notice something, burn damage didn't apply after I made the attack, meaning that if you take an opponent all the way to the end of the turn limits, Pokemon checkup doesn't happen after the very last attack, the very last turn. You don't have a last turn and then a checkup. It's just no checkup at all. So theoretically, if I had died to this burn damage, well, because there's no checkup at this point, it would still end in a tie. Had it been turn 29 though, then yes, my Venusaur might have been taken out by burn damage if it only had 20 HP left, because there is still a Pokemon checkup. Anyway, this was just an extra fun fact that I came across as I was doing the testing. Now, how about Arceus EX's ability, Fabled Luster, so it can prevent all special conditions? Well, this one you probably already know. The opponent's Makago tries to burn my Arceus. Arceus doesn't become burned because of its ability. But I do want to cover Arceus anyway because somebody asked me this in my Discord the other day. They said, how come Arceus blocks any special condition, yet for some reason when I was hit by something like Arbok that prevented it from retreating or Vulpix that prevents it from attacking, how come those effects still applied? So just to illustrate that point, I've got a Vulpix here using Tail Whip, which if I flip ahead, my opponent cannot attack for the next turn. So as you can see, it's got this blocked icon, which does apply to Arceus EX. And the main reason is simply that this is not a special condition. It is just an effect. So this is the opponent's screen. You can see that they can't make the attack because of Tail Whip. The same thing can be said for Can't Retreat, so I used Houndoom to apply Can't Retreat on the opponent, and this is the opponent's screen once again because of the fact that it isn't a special condition, it's just an effect, so the opponent cannot retreat. And just to be sure, I also checked it with Smokescreen and Wheezing, which when applied means your opponent has to flip a coin, kind of like Confused, and if it's tails, that attack doesn't happen. Now, the difference with Confuse is that Confuse will persist. So unless you cure the confusion, your opponent has to keep flipping coins every attack to check whether they can make the attack. Whereas Smokescreen, it only applies for that one turn every time you make this attack. Regardless, as you can see here, that effect still happened. So it still applied to Arceus despite its ability. Once again, because this is not a special condition. So the way to counter these effects is, not surprisingly, switch out, so retreat. If you have Vulpix apply Can't Attack to your Arceus, if you retreat, that then gets cured. Kind of like a special condition. But of course you can't cure these with Pokemon Center Lady or Lumberry. But what if you have Can't Retreat? So if you have Can't Retreat, how do you counter that? Well, interestingly, you can use Solgaleo EX because its ability bypasses Can't Retreat. So here I've got Arbok applying the Can't Retreat condition to my Cyclizar, and then what I do is, as you can see, my Cyclizar can't retreat, so I use Rising Road, which is Solgaleo EX's ability, bypasses that, and then I can attack again, of course, with a different Pokemon. Needless to say, if the cannot retreat is applied to Solgaleo, unless you have another Solgaleo in your bench, then it can't retreat either. So then you just have to use Solgaleo to attack in this situation. But what is more interesting is the fact that if your Solgaleo has cannot attack applied to it. So for example, Omastar can apply can't attack effect on Solgaleo, of course, then I can't attack during this turn, or can I? I can still retreat. Now, normally you can't retreat again, even if you had enough energy. So my Cyclizar couldn't retreat again, but because of Solgaleo's ability, I can bring it back out. So this is why I said earlier in the video that special conditions, in fact, just most effects altogether, don't really affect Solgaleo as much as everything else because of Rising Road. It can bring itself back out to the active slot after curing itself of the conditions, of course at the cost of some retreat costs, but it doesn't cost a lot of energies to attack anyway, so this is a strategy. How about evolution? Most of you should know that special conditions can be cured if you evolve a Pokemon. So something like this Pikipek evolving, it was asleep and now it's been cured of the sleep. Does this apply to can't attack and can't retreat as well? Well, why don't we try it and see? So I've got Arbok here who's going to make the attack so that I can't retreat. Does 60 damage to Cosmoem, and now with Cosmoem unable to attack, if I evolve it, does it also clear that effect just like a status condition or special condition? And it does, but it doesn't show the animation for clearing a special condition. So I guess the game acknowledges that it's a bit different to a special condition. You are cured of it, but just not being cured with an animation. But I must say that it's not right to say evolving clears all effects, because have a look at this. If I use red or Giovanni or blue, any of these cards, they all give an effect. So red adds 20 damage to my Pokemon, but if I evolve it, it's not like red's effect gets cleared. It remains. It's here. It's still here after evolution. So it's not true to say that all effects gets cleared on evolution. You kind of just have to know which ones do and which ones don't. And even X speed is something that goes into the effects list. So if I use X speed, you can see my active Pokemon now has 1 less retreat cost. And if I use one more, I can of course have 2 of these, and then now it costs 2 less energies to retreat. But it's not like on retreating that effect goes away. Of course, you can't retreat twice in the same turn, so I can't retreat again now that I've retreated once, but the effect is actually still there. So if there was some ability or attack that depends on this effects list, so for example, the more effects you have on your Pokemon, the more damage I do to it, or something crazy like that, that doesn't currently exist, then this does matter. The effects are there and not cleared on retreating or evolution for some of these effects. When I was doing this research, I wondered, does it actually matter that I've retreated once, but the effect still persists on my new active Pokemon? I was looking for cards that do damage based on retreat costs, and I did actually come across something like that, and I didn't even realize this existed. It's not currently in TCG Pocket, but in some older cards, I couldn't find it in newer cards, but in some older cards, there were attacks that dealt damage based on the number of colorless energy in the defending Pokemon's retreat cost. So I guess it is possible that the effects on your active Pokemon, like reducing the retreat cost, can have implications outside of just retreating itself. Anyway, this is just a side point. Masquerain is one of them. This Dugong also does 40 damage plus 10 for each colorless energy on the retreat cost. This Dark Muck also does it. And finally, there's one more effect I want to talk about, and it's the ability to do additional damage on the next turn. You might have seen the likes of Crabominable or Togekiss being used in decks in ranked matches. You may have also noticed that Cyclizar also does something like that, and Donphan can also do additional damage in the next turn. So in this example, Cyclizar, after having made one attack in the turn prior, gets this up arrow that tells us that it has an additional 20 damage in the next turn. The description simply says during your next turn, or rather whoever made this attack, the Pokemon's over acceleration attack does plus 20 damage. It doesn't clearly state whether that effect can be cleared in any special way, and I'm about to show you how. If you've ever been afraid of the Crabominable or Togekiss attacks, there is a counter for it, and it's Cyrus or Sabrina. As it turns out, by using Cyrus or Sabrina to send the active Cyclizar or Crabominable or Togekiss or whatever it is, they lose that effect. As you can see here, after I swapped these two Cyclizar out, the shiny one that had the additional damage applied to it no longer has that additional effect. But then you might say, perhaps the effects would still be there if we swap the shiny Cyclizar that got benched back out. Maybe then the effect will reapply in the next turn. So what I did was I made sure that happened. I swapped the Cyclizar that did attack in the last turn back out. But unfortunately, it did not keep the additional damage. So the text isn't very clear. The text simply says if this Cyclizar attacks again in the next turn, it will do additional damage. It didn't say that if it got benched and then came back out again in the same next turn, whether that effect would still be there. So now we know that you can remove that additional damage by simply using Sabrina or Cyrus to bench that active Pokemon. Even if they come back out in the next turn, they won't do the additional damage. Again, that's just something that you kind of have to know. Hey, just for completeness sake, I even use Victory Bell, or you could use Pidgeot as well, to bring that Pokemon back out to the active slot in the very same turn I use Sabrina. And yeah, they don't keep that additional effect, even if I bring them back out in the same turn. And by the way, just one little side note, if you do have this additional damage effect and you decide not to attack on that turn, so you'll see it here now that Cyclops is not going to attack, going to end their turn, you lose that additional damage. So that actually means that besides Sabrina and Cyrus, you can do things like remove an energy, like with Beedrill or Team Rocket Grunt. And if you can prevent them from making an attack in the next turn, they will not keep the additional damage the turn after. So that is also a counterplay for this type of effect. So yeah, that was all about special conditions and conditions that are not special conditions and exactly how they work. I hope this video has helped you guys prepare for niche situations. They're niche right now because there's not a lot of status conditions or effects being played in the meta. But at the very least, we saw Solgaleo being quite unique in its ability to clear some of those special conditions or effects. And currently, Solgaleo is heavily used in ranked matches. Regardless, keep this video somewhere because you might want to come back and reference this when the meta changes and we see a lot more special conditions or effects in ranked matches. Thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about any special situations or niche situations that you don't understand, let me know in the comment section below.